So, Clay Parker from last week, the question that I got from more people than any other question, or the thing commented on and pointed out, was that he told jokes the entire time. And that is not something you would expect to see from a Japanese speaker. Now, the first thing I want to say is, this is a contest. He's competing, and so are all the other speakers, in a contest with rules. If any of you were ever on the track team, or you had friends who were on the track team, maybe they competed in the 100-meter sprint, which is a very simple contest. Here's the starting line. 100 meters away is the finish line. Run as fast as you can. But there's another contest called the 100-meter hurdles. And when you run the 100-meter hurdles, every few meters, you jump over something. Now, it's not necessary to jump to be running. You can run without jumping. But in the hurdles, that's just the contest. The contest is, can you be fast while jumping over things? The contest he was competing in was, can you give a speech? Can you put jokes into the speech that are good jokes, that work, that people laugh at? So one of the specific questions I got was, in what kind of situation would you ever give a speech like that? There's a category, we call them special occasion speeches. Sometimes you might throw an end-of-the-year banquet, and everybody would get together and have dinner. And then you would invite someone to be the speaker. About 7 years ago, at Bushnell University, our graduating seniors had a senior banquet, and they invited me to be the speaker at the senior banquet. And I gave a speech that had lots of jokes in it. That's why they call it after dinner speaking. There are special occasion speeches tend to be on holidays. They tend to be to celebrate the history, sometimes of a business, sometimes of a college. Any speech where the point is not to solve a problem, but the point is just to enjoy and celebrate who you are as a group. That would be a special occasion speech. Not all special occasion speeches need jokes, but some of them do. So to answer that question, when would you ever speak like that? It would probably be a special occasion speech. But you have seen the national champion in informative speaking had jokes in his speech. The national champion in persuasive speaking had jokes in her speech. They didn't do like Clay. They didn't tell one joke after another for 10 minutes. They had a few. But I think we've already established that if you speak for Western audiences, for almost any kind of speech, some jokes will probably make it more effective. Research tells us using humor in a speech for a Western audience will make you seem more intelligent. It will make you seem more likable. It will make the audience feel more motivated to pay attention to your speech. We said previously, in the United States, communication is speaker responsible. If people are confused, if there's a misunderstanding, they blame the speaker. The speaker wasn't clear. Japan, says the research, is listener responsible. If there's a misunderstanding, the listeners didn't listen well enough. And we've said before, American audiences, if they don't find you interesting, They'll just ignore you and sit and daydream, or they will think about what they have to do for the rest of the day. A speaker for a Western audience has to motivate the audience to pay attention, and humor can do that. Now, there are a couple of dangers to humor. The chief danger, the research is very clear on this. Let's say you gave a 20-minute presentation, which is a pretty standard length in a business. Let's say you had 4 good jokes in your 20-minute presentation. All of them were funny. All of them made everyone laugh. The problem is, afterward, if the audience is asked about your presentation, those 4 jokes are what they will remember. And they may not remember the important part. They may find it more difficult to remember the actual business of the speech, which is why it's very important that your jokes be very connected to the topic, to the subject matter of the speech. If right after your best joke, you then said one of the important things you want the audience to remember, and it's connected to the joke, then humor can be very effective. The other danger of using humor, the pressure to be funny, can lead American speakers sometimes to go, the idiom in English is to go too far. And what it means is you might say something that's offensive. One of the questions I got was, is it ever okay when giving a speech to use bad language? My answer is, when I teach both introductory and advanced public speaking, I tell my students, don't ever do it. Because some people in the room may enjoy it, they may appreciate it. But other people in the room may suddenly dislike the way you communicate, dislike your values, and not think you're very skillful as a communicator. And the ones who like it, they'll forget it pretty quickly. But the ones who don't like it, they'll never forget it. So it's just not worth it. I should also say, in answering that question, American speakers do sometimes use bad language. In workplaces, in business presentations, not very often. And you would need to be very high in authority. If you were the president of the company, you might be able to say something to use bad language if you were using it to really emphasize your point. Anybody else, it would be a very bad idea. I've strayed a little bit from talking about jokes, but there were 3 other questions talking about his jokes that I want to address before I move to the next bullet point. One of them was, how did he design his jokes? How did he know what his audience would recognize? How did he know what they would find funny? The jokes required background knowledge. How did he know what background knowledge his audience would have? And there's a very simple answer. He wrote that speech in August of 2021, maybe even earlier, maybe June or July. He then competed with it almost every weekend until April 2022. And every time he gave the speech, he noticed, what do people laugh at? Which of the jokes, even though I think they're funny and my teammates think they're funny, are the judges not laughing at? And the speech was rewritten and rewritten and rewritten. By April, he knew every joke in that speech was guaranteed to get a laugh. It was a process of trial and error. I wanted to tell you very briefly the story of a comedy team in the United States. These 3 men were born in the 1800s, and they began their comedy career performing live. They would travel from city to city, and in small theaters, they would put on their comedy act. Their name was Marx, and the name of the act was the Marx Brothers. When the first movies in the United States were being made in the teens and 20s, they took the act that they had performed live and they just did it in front of a camera. And they knew it would be funny for the same reason Clay knew his speech would be funny. They had performed it in front of so many people. And any joke that people weren't laughing at, they just got rid of. And they would try something new and something else and something else until people laughed. After they had made about 4 movies, they ran out of jokes they had used while performing live. When they made their 5th movie, they got very afraid because they did not know what audiences would find funny or not. So before they made the movie, they traveled around the country and performed the movie live hundreds of times, rewriting all the jokes until they were funny. That's really what you have to do if you want to guarantee that your jokes will be funny. I mentioned to you before that it's okay to change your outline for this speech because when you prepare a speech, you're always making little adjustments and revisions, even sometimes while giving the speech. I mention that because while you were all coming in today, I suddenly understood part of the reason, I think, that American speakers use so much more humor than Japanese speakers. We've said a few times, Japan is a high uncertainty avoidance culture, and the United States is moderately low in uncertainty avoidance. In the United States, my students during class will raise their hand and ask questions because it's okay to say something nobody was prepared for. It's very common. I think probably there's more humor in American speeches because you never know if a joke will be funny. It's always uncertain. But to American speakers and American audiences, that's okay. That's normal. And I think probably for Japanese speakers and Japanese audiences, because humor is uncertain, the quality of your research, the quality of your preparation you can control. So uncertainty is lower. I think that probably is part of it. One more thing to say in answering the question about how do you know what's funny and what isn't. Years ago, when I was the head of the speech and debate program at Arizona State University, I had an assistant coach whose name was Ted. Ted had competed in a speech event called extemporaneous speaking. Now, in that event, they give you your topic, they give you 30 minutes to write the speech, and you then immediately give it. And in those 30 minutes, you have to do research. And all the topics are current events. A good extemporaneous speaking topic might be, which artificial intelligence engine will be the most popular by next year? ChatGPT or Bard? And in 30 minutes, you would research and write a speech and then give it. Now, Ted was national champion in extemporaneous speaking more than once, which is very difficult to do. Only a few people have ever done it. So a lot of people hired Ted to coach them because they wanted to get better. And I've told you all that about the event and about Ted to tell you this. One of his rules for giving an extemporaneous speech was every time 3 jokes. You have to write 3 jokes. And remember, They only had 30 minutes and they had to do research. But in Ted's experience, and he was one of the best ever, you needed not only a joke, you needed more than one joke. And he also said students that he was coaching who were learning how to do it, if every time they attempted 3 jokes, probably one of them would be terrible and nobody would laugh. The first few times they tried, all 3 of them might be terrible. But as they did it over and over again, sometimes accidentally, they'd put together a joke that was funny and the judge would laugh. And the longer they did it, the more they learned how to be funny. So it was a high priority, and it was something you only learned by doing it over and over. 2 more questions on this. One of them was, can you give us any tips on how to analyze your audience? I can give you a quick tip. It really should be its own lecture, but the thing about this class has never been basic public speaking. It's just how do you fine-tune public speaking for a Western audience. But my quick advice on analyzing an audience, when I teach it, I talk with my students about the word we use, segments. Segments of the audience. If you give a speech and you pretend everybody in the audience is exactly the same, the speech will be bad. If, on the other hand, you try to figure out what are the differences with each individual, the job is too big and you'll give up because you can't do it. So what you look for is, are there groups? Are there pockets of the audience that all have something in common? Sometimes it's age. If I'm going to give a speech to this audience, well, the first thing is I'm giving a speech all to women. That's not a segment, that's the whole audience. I also have an age range, I would guess, of probably 18 to 25. That would change how I give the speech. But I might also look for, do I know where you're from? What part of Japan regionally? Do I know anything about people's income? Are you very wealthy? Very poor? If I'm giving a speech about a social problem, do I know about what kinds of attitudes there might be in the room? You try to find some things that you know a large part of the audience have in common, and then think, what can I do with my topic and my content that will be best suited for them? So that's the quick advice I can give. Look at your audience, try to see what segments there are, and adapt. Final detail, I had one person ask his joke about, oh yeah, win, whir, what was that? What that was, those were characters from a video game. And what he said was, this is the video game is Super Mario Brothers, I think. He said that he was Luigi. He named an American politician and said the American politician was Waluigi, and Waluigi in the game says, wah, or something like that. And then he said another American politician was Wario, who says, whir. So he had developed that imitation. It sounded silly, but when he did that imitation, it made people laugh. So because he was going to talk about those 2 politicians, he compared the politicians to the video game characters, and it made people laugh. That's what that meant. Okay, other things that you pointed out or asked questions. He changed pitch and he changed volume to share the joke. And I have thought for a very long time that speakers for Western audiences have an advantage if they have experience in theater, if they have acted in plays. Because, as you've seen through the 3 speeches that we have worked on, American speakers or speakers from American audiences who succeed, who are judged the best of the best, they tend to be very animated, very expressive. Something you've said to me is the ideal for a speaker speaking to a Japanese audience is more like an announcer, someone presenting the news on television, someone reciting the stops as the recorded voice on the train. That's the ideal for Japanese audiences. What we said before about American audiences being speaker responsible. You have to hold their attention. And those changes in pitch and volume helped hold the audience's attention. Then there was a question about how he switched from being funny to being serious, very, very smoothly and suddenly. And the question was, how do you do that? Well, the point I made earlier about when you tell the best joke in your speech, try to connect it to something important you need to say. That's something people who compete in that event, they learn how to do. Really what they do is they write the speech ahead of time with no jokes. So they plan, what do they need to say to give a good speech on that topic? And then they go back and look for opportunities to make a joke. And they look for what are the most important ideas in the speech. Can I lead into those with a joke? There's an expression that people who compete in speech in America, an expression they use to describe this. And it always made me laugh because they say, funny, 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 death. And what they mean is, get your audience to laugh, get them to laugh again, get them to laugh harder, and then immediately give them the serious idea. Now, it can't sound like you're changing the subject. You have to be talking about the same subject, but find a way to be funny and then switch into the point you need to make. One other thing I might explain. We don't always laugh or tell jokes only when we're happy and having fun. Laughing is often a way to manage stressful, difficult situations. So if something is painful, something is burdensome, we laugh about it. There's a whole study of what emergency medical technicians who will travel out in the middle of the night to the scenes of automobile accidents and see dead bodies all over the road. They have their own sense of humor, their own kind of dark humor. They use it with each other to manage the really powerful emotions they have over all that death and suffering. So sometimes what speakers do in this kind of situation, they'll say something that will make people laugh, but people will also recognize there's truth in it. And if we replayed this speech, we could probably find a couple of jokes that were funny because of something true that was a little bit painful. All right. The next question, by now a very familiar one. He was too casual. He was not formal. And actually, what I have on my notes to explain here, I've already explained. Because this is where there was the follow-up question, what kind of speech would you ever do this in? And we've talked about that. The one detail I'll add is increasingly at award ceremonies, when people are given an important award in the United States, it's common for them to give a speech of acceptance. And there was a time when acceptance speeches were expected to be very formal, very grateful, very polite. But in 2023, in the United States, the most common way to approach giving an acceptance speech for an award is to make a lot of jokes. That tends to be very well received. It was pointed out that the audience laughed a lot. And it was pointed out that a Japanese audience probably wouldn't. That the ideal for polite audience behavior in Japan is to stay completely silent. Here I should say, I want to remind you, Japan is classified as a neutral culture. So good manners is to show no emotion or show the correct emotion. There are cultures in the world classified as the opposite, classified as affective. Spain, Italy, Greece, much of South America, high affective. Whatever emotion they have, they show it. They may burst out crying in the middle of a conversation. Or if they want to emphasize a point, they may start yelling until their face turns red. But they're used to that. That's how they talk to each other. The United States is moderately affective. Not high affective, but moderately affective. Laughing is almost always okay. Any public speaking situation, if the speaker says something with humor to it, the audience will laugh, and it's good manners to do so. I have one quick story to tell you that I heard years ago, which makes a point about Japanese neutrality versus affective audience response in other countries. So the musical Les Miserables, which was first staged in the 1980s, just about every country it went to. It started in Paris, then London, then in New York on Broadway, and then there were companies elsewhere. But the night that it opened everywhere, as it finished, the audience would just jump up on their feet, clap as hard as they could, scream and whistle, and show their appreciation. Except in Tokyo. When it opened in Tokyo, they finished the first performance, and the curtain came down and they heard, and the performers looked at each other. Did we perform badly? But this went on for 20 minutes. They just kept clapping. And it was explained to the performers, Japanese audiences will not be loud, but the length of the applause is how they show that you were really something special. So that may pin down the difference and why the American audience felt so free to laugh. Now, there was a follow-up question. Does the audience reaction make a difference as far as whether the speaker is good or bad? And I have two answers to this. First of all, an audience who responds will make the speaker more effective. This is something that's been experimentally demonstrated over and over again. I tell my American students what you should do in your most boring class that you hate going to. The next time you go, get several of your friends to do this. Sit up straight, make direct eye contact with the professor, and look like it's the most interesting class you've ever taken. Then come back and tell me what happened. And when they come back, they say, the professor suddenly got more energetic, more interesting. They suddenly became a better teacher. Speakers respond to what they see audiences doing. The second part of my answer, though, is it a better speech if people are laughing? With this contest, after dinner speaking, the people who came and listened to the finals, they knew these were the best of the best, and they came because they thought they would enjoy it. They also know in that community, among people who compete, it's good manners to laugh, at least politely, when the speaker makes a joke. But on top of that, do the judges notice which speeches get the most laughter? Yes, they definitely do. And for that event, more laughter means better speech. For an ordinary speech, would more laughter mean the speech was better? No. Humor is useful when it's useful, but I can imagine a lot of speeches where the audience might laugh more and even say they enjoyed it more, but the speech might not persuade them, or they might not come away understanding. It's a matter of what is the purpose of the speech. The last comment that we got about this speech was that he continued to speak when he walked over to this side and was off camera. The only thing I'll say about that, I'm going to defend him. That's not his fault. As I said last week, the tournament, the people organizing the contest, they were sloppy. They didn't put a person in charge of the camera. The camera was just pointed at the stage. He wasn't watching the camera, and he shouldn't have been. He was watching his judges. The camera was way back there. So if they had just had anybody at all do that to the camera when he walked a little further, you would have seen the whole thing. I did also get a question about, he didn't end with thank you. Is it ever okay to end your speech by saying thank you? Depending on how we're doing on time today, I have one more speech for us to watch. It's not a contest speech. It's not a college student. It's actually a TED Talk. But when you see it, you'll see she's an American speaker speaking to an American audience, and she does end the speech saying, thank you. They do it sometimes, but often speakers will end their speech and not say thank you. And as someone, I have taught public speaking for 30 years and I've coached it, people who end their speech with thank you tend to convey to the audience that they're not very skillful, that they are amateurs. Professional speakers almost never end a speech with thank you. They end it with something that will make the speech memorable. Thank you is what you say when you can't think of a good ending. You'll notice none of the 3 speeches we saw that were judged the best in the country, none of them used it. But sometimes Americans do. I just think we can do better. All right. So that brings us then to 2 last bits of new content. Now, the new content we will talk about today, the first part has nothing to do with your assignment, but it is important. Many years ago, I got to talk to a lot of business leaders who were hiring students from my college, and I said, I teach public speaking. What could I do to do it better? What do our students need to understand that they don't? And the answer I got a lot of times was, they need to know at the end of the speech how to take questions from the audience and answer them. Because everybody comes out of college knowing how to give a 3-point speech with a PowerPoint. Everybody can do that. But very often, American audiences want to ask questions at the end. And people who've just graduated college, they panic and they freeze if anyone asks a question. So I have been teaching this unit on how to take questions ever since. I don't know how common it is for Japanese audiences to ask questions afterward, but American audiences do. So here are some things to know if the audience is going to expect to ask you questions. The first thing, you don't, at the end of your speech, you don't ask, you announce. Let me explain what I mean by that. New speakers will make the mistake they get to the end of their presentation and they will say, "Does anyone have any questions?" Very commonly, the audience at that point will say nothing. Instead, what you should do, you end the speech and you say, "Now I will take questions." You don't ask, you announce it. You signal to them questions are expected. Questions are good. When the audience asks good questions, they will tell you which part you weren't clear on. They will tell you what they're confused about. This is great. You want questions. So don't ask for them because they won't give you any. Announce that you will now take questions and you're more likely to get some. When you answer a question, it's important that you give the short version of the answer, the short version. This is a skill that you might have to practice. Very commonly, American public speaking students, if they begin answering a difficult, complicated question, they'll talk for a little bit and then they realize they should change the explanation, so they'll say the first part again, and then they kind of say it a third time and they'll talk round and round the question. And the answer goes on and on. And what that signals to the audience is that they don't really understand their answer. Your answer to any question should be fairly short. It should be accurate. It should be as complete as it can be. But always you should be thinking, is my answer so long that the audience forgets what the question even was? And am I talking so much that the audience will think that I'm talking to cover up the fact that I don't understand? So, the answer should be relatively short. One common situation. What do you do when they ask a question and you don't know the answer? And I warn my students, you will be tempted to make something up. Don't do it. Because at least one person in the room will recognize that you made it up. They'll talk to other people. And at that point, you have no credibility. That whole presentation you gave was a waste of time. So if you don't know the answer, don't make it up. This is the correct answer. But this is not the complete correct answer. The complete correct answer is, I don't know, but. I don't know, but I know where you can find that information. If they ask you something and you know where the information exists but you don't have it, tell them, I don't know, but I'll tell you where that information is. It's on the Tsuda University website. You go to this place and there's a spreadsheet and it's right there. So tell them where to find it if you know where the information can be found. Another variation is, I don't know, but I know who does know. Maybe you work with someone who has that information and could answer that question off the top of their head. It's a good, complete answer to tell them. I don't know, but my colleague does know. And my colleague is easy to reach. The final variation, I don't know, but I will find out and get back to you. You can do that. I don't recommend you use this one if either of these will work. Because if anything goes wrong, if you get busy, if you're just forgetful and you don't get back with them, they may conclude that you didn't know and you weren't honest and you just were wanting to get out of the room. So if you tell them you'll find out, go to extreme measures to make sure you don't forget. So then, on some occasions, while fielding questions, you might have difficult questioners. Difficult questioners. People who do things while asking questions that are not helpful. There are 3 standard versions or variations on this. Someone might ask a question that is completely irrelevant, that has nothing to do with your speech. Maybe I've just given a speech about recent research about how noise can damage people's audio nerves and it can hurt their hearing. That's a talk I give a lot. And I say, I will now take questions. And someone raises their hand and says, we know that nutrition is really important to health and that breakfast is very important, and I like to have cereal with breakfast. What do you think is the best breakfast cereal? And I see some people smiling. I've heard questions more random than that. Sometimes they may ask a question that has nothing to do with what you just talked about. And here's what you do. It's funny, when I teach this, I am almost teaching my American students to be a little Japanese. Because I tell them, compliment them on the question so they don't lose face. And then redirect them to what the speech was about. So if someone asked me the question I just described, I might say, oh, I love breakfast cereal too. You and I should get together after, and I'll tell you my favorite breakfast cereals. But right now, what we're talking about is hearing damage from loud noises like music. So let's keep talking about that. You and I can talk about cereal later. So make it a positive experience for them, but get back to the topic. Sometimes you may have a long-winded questioner. Maybe they're asking a good question that has to do with what the speech was about. But in asking their question, they just go on and on and on, and they take forever to get to the end of the question. What you have to do, if you can figure out what the question is, gently and cheerfully interrupt them to finish the question and ask, is that what you're asking? Then compliment them on the question. That's a great question. And then answer it. Very often, people take a long time to ask a question if they're trying to think it out. If they kind of have an idea, but they haven't really understood or grasped their own idea. And if you're listening, you might know what it is they're asking before they do. And at that point, interrupting them and pinning down what they're trying to ask, it's surprising how often they welcome that. So, if you can, summarize what they're asking. Remember to compliment the question. Tell them it's a great question, and then answer it. The most difficult questioner of all. I don't think this would commonly happen in Japan. It does happen in the United States. The hostile questioner. The questioner who has listened to you speak and now does not like you, is angry, and thinks you are their enemy. And so, while asking their question, they might insult you, they might use bad language, they are nasty while asking the question. What I teach my students, there are two things you do. You try the first one, and often it is enough. And if it doesn't work, do the second one. For the first one, try to find something that the two of you agree about. So maybe I have been giving a speech about how loud noises can damage your hearing. And maybe a college student says, you old people always want to ruin our fun. My parents wouldn't let me listen to the music I liked. This university won't let me play my music loud because we have quiet hours, and now here you are saying that my music is destroying my hearing. Tell the truth. You just hate it when young people have fun because you're old and you can't have fun anymore, so you don't want us to. What I think I might say is, I think what you and I agree about is we don't like being told what to do, and it makes us feel frustrated. And I bet you've had a lot of people tell you what to do. And isn't it annoying? And try to get them to where they can see that the two of you agree on that thing they are upset about. And if you can get to that point of agreement, then maybe you can say, and if you let loud sounds damage your hearing, play your music all day. If your ears are damaged, you won't hear it. I'm trying to help you enjoy your music by protecting your hearing. You need your ears. I would try to make that point. That's the first. Can you find something you and the hostile questioner agree about? Because if they sense that you're not going to fight back, that you don't think of them as an enemy, and you do agree with them about something, it may calm them down. Sometimes it doesn't. So if that happens, if you tried calming them down and they're still angry, this may be very, very challenging or difficult. What I teach my American students, look them right in the eye, use dominance nonverbals, give them your answer one more time, and then break off contact with them and look at another part of the room. So let's imagine my hostile questioner is right here in this empty seat. And they just asked me their question about ruining fun, and I said, isn't it awful when people tell us what to do and they're still angry? And they yell at me some more. This is what I would now do. Loud sounds damage your hearing. If you want to be able to hear, you need to protect your ears. Now, who else has a question? Look directly at them. Be firm. Break off contact. Come over here and ask for a question. Commonly, for American audiences, they're embarrassed by that person. Someone over here will think of a question so you can talk to people over here. And if they're still yelling away, you may need to call security. So, those are some guidelines for what to do if you need to field questions. I will now take questions. But you're high uncertainty avoidance, so I won't get any. All right. The other bit of new content I wanted to talk about today is the fear of public speaking. And to get to our discussion of that, I have something I want to show you. This is Ringo Starr, who was the drummer for the Beatles, who has probably performed in front of more and larger audiences than anybody in human history. And I have a clip here I want to play for you, and I'm going to try. I don't know if the technology will cooperate here. Let me see if there's an ad, of course. I am going to try to turn on the auto-generated Japanese closed captioning to see if that will help. Bear with me for just a moment. That's not where I want it. That's where I want it. And, oh, captions are unavailable. That's good. That wasn't happening before. Okay, if I can't get closed captioning, then change my mind, and we will skip that part. I will tell you what he was going to say. What he was going to say, or what he did say in that clip, and I can send you the clip if you're at all interested. Every time he has to go out in front of an audience, he gets bad stage fright. And I wanted to say, it's not unique to you. Everybody feels that way. But he said something even more. What he does, they introduce him, and he runs out on stage. He says he never walks, he runs out on stage, and running out on stage gets the stage fright under control. Let me explain why. Stage fright is epinephrine, norepinephrine, and cortisol. Here they are in katakana. Epinephrine, norepinephrine, and cortisol are your fight or flight chemicals. They are released by your adrenal glands that sit right here on top of your kidneys. They are chemicals, nothing more. Your body releases these when you're in front of the room, for the same reason that if you stand on a tall building and look down, you feel dizzy and queasy, and a lot of people are afraid of heights. It is hard-circuited into you that being in a high place is dangerous because you could fall and die. It is hard-circuited into you that lots of eyeballs all looking at you is dangerous because there are a lot of predatory animals that hunt in packs. Lots of eyes looking at you could mean that you are dinner. It's also dangerous even if the eyes are human, because a lot of violence is done by mobs of people. Eye contact at all, eye contact from one person is arousing. It tends to produce physical activation. Eye contact from 20 people, or 30, or however many are here, that's a lot of activation. That's a lot of epinephrine, norepinephrine, and cortisol. Now, one important thing about naming it, when you know what's happening, you have these sensations, not because you're in danger, but because your body is built to release those chemicals. When you have a name for it, it's not mysterious, and you can do something about it. Now, do you remember what Ringo Starr does with his nervousness? He runs out on stage. These chemicals give you a burst of energy. The way I explain it to my American students is it's rocket fuel. And if you have rocket fuel sitting around and you can smell it and it's leaking, it's bad. But if you put rocket fuel into a rocket and use it to drive the rocket, it's good. And you've seen all three of these American speakers, how big their delivery is, how loud, how animated. They get out there and they act. Where do you think all the energy for that comes from? It's from the fight or flight chemicals. And as you use it to have big, energetic delivery, you burn it up. And when you burn it up, you don't feel nervous anymore. That's why Ringo Starr runs out on stage. It burns some of this. That's what your body produces it for, so use it. Second thing I can say about the fear of public speaking. Very best thing you can do is get up and speak every chance you get. The more experience you have giving speeches, the sensation of feeling nervous never goes away. I felt nervous today, but I have done this for so long that the feeling of nervousness is very familiar, and I know it's nothing to worry about. So lots of experience is one of the best ways to cope with the fear. Probably the next best way is to over-prepare. I sometimes have speeches that are very, very important. Those are the ones where I genuinely do feel nervous. This past April, I think, although for me it was in March, the sermon to welcome the freshers to Tsuda at Tsuda Chapel, Tsuda invited me to give that. And that was an experience I had never had. That was a new speaking situation. I knew a fair number of people would see it, and it was important to me. I really wanted to do well. So I spent easily a month writing that speech, and I practiced it 25, 30 times. Practiced it obsessively until I knew it backward and forward, and that helped me. The more I knew the speech, the less these particular fight or flight chemicals bothered me. The last thing I want to say about the fear of public speaking. I first taught about the fear of public speaking in 1994. I came upon my best lesson about the fear of public speaking about 8 years ago. It took me that long to realize that this was something I could offer my students. At the first class meeting, I mentioned that I'm a Christian and I teach at a Christian university. I think I have some students in here who in the first half of this term took how Christianity helps explain the way Westerners communicate. One topic we took up in that class was relational mobility. And I mentioned relational mobility in here when I talked about capturing an audience's attention. But in the other class, when we talked about how Westerners find it very easy to meet new people, to make new friends, to talk to strangers without being introduced, we said in that class there are a lot of influences that come out of the Christian faith. And those influences say that you should be able to share with people the difficult parts of yourself, the parts that are embarrassing, the parts that you struggle with, that you can tell other people your own story and it can benefit them. And probably most importantly of all, it's a core teaching in the Christian faith that because the Creator loves all of us perfectly, what the Creator wants is for us to love everybody else. And not once, but it's a command. And so I teach my students, take a minute before you give a speech. Look at your audience. It doesn't have to be a long moment. Once you get used to doing it, you can do it in about 1 second. Look out at your audience and see how lovable they are. Take a second and just love them. And when you can do that, when you love your audience, how could you possibly be afraid of them? About 8 years ago, I started teaching that lesson in my basic public speaking class, and that is what my students have been telling me, that's the one that works. We can try being hyper to burn up our fight or flight chemicals. We're learning how to speak. We'll practice our speech. But the opportunity to look at the audience, take a second and just love them, and then start the speech. If you can get to the point where you genuinely experience loving your audience, then think about the content you've come prepared with and how it's going to help them, how they can take this and use it. And you get to where you're highly motivated. You can't wait to begin because these are lovable people and you're going to do something good for them. All right. With that, I have just finished the last speech, last lecture I will give in Japan.